be with you guys today. I have to say, for the sake of anybody who joins us on Facebook, that I'm wearing my lovely tie this morning. Addison gave me this as an early Christmas present yesterday, and I told her that anything my daughter gets me, I'll wear it. And then she said she's going to give me a tutu next. So I may have to reverse course on that statement. But anyway, so that's why I'm wearing this great tie today. I did bring another tie to change into for whenever we did Lord's Supper or later. I thought maybe this wasn't appropriate for Lord's Supper Sunday, but anyway, we'll be all right. If you have your books, you can open up to session 3. If you're in your Bible, Luke chapter 2. We're going to be talking about Jesus' birth and the proclamation that came from the angels and the proclamation from the shepherds. This is, whenever I read this story and I hear, Luke chapter 2 and hear the Christmas story, I always hear it in Linus's voice. Anybody else? It's just that kind of kid voice, but insanely articulate kid voice, where he pronounces everything just perfectly. But anyway, that's what I always think about whenever I hear this story and hear somebody read it. I always think about Linus. Has anybody see the little video of the kid that was going on Facebook this week? A little boy in a red sweater, and he was reading this story, and he was real articulate about it. He got really animated at certain points, And there were shepherds in the fields keeping watch. Anyway, it's pretty funny. I saw that going on Facebook this week. Well, so let's just get into it, and I'm going to kind of take it little by little and kind of walk through this together. So it starts out in verse 4. Joseph also went out from the town of Nazareth, Galilee, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family line of David, to be registered along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was pregnant. And so this follows after the introduction part, which says that there was a census, and every family, every man had to go back to his hometown. Basically, his family, his family place. So, Valencia said they're going to be going to Crockett and Clarksville this week. So, that's where family is. So that's why they go back to those places. And so we had the same kind of situation here. Basically, for Joseph, he's going back to the old family home place. I know a couple years ago, whenever my family all gathered together for Thanksgiving, we all went down to my grandparents' house, which is out in Dyeville, and there's an old farm, the old farmhouse that was built like in the 1800s, late 1800s, mid 1800s, that they actually still rent out as a rent house. It should be a historical marker, but you can still make a few bucks off of it, so let's use it as a rent house. So we all lined up on the front porch and took pictures at the old family homestead. And so I'm kind of understanding what's going on here. Joseph has to go back to the city of David, which is Bethlehem. And so he goes up from Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of Bethlehem, because he was of the family line of David. Now we talked about this. Last week. Let me see if I can erase that weird red line that I made there. We talked about this last week. How the family line of David was important. That the Messiah was supposed to come from the line of David, and so he. As you go back through Matthew's genealogy, you see how the Messiah Jesus is traced all the way back from Abraham and through David's lineage to show that he was the fulfillment of the promises of Abraham, the promises to Abraham that all the nations of the world would be blessed through his family, and that he was also the promise given to David, that David would always have somebody sitting on his throne. So this lineage is important. And so because he is being brought into the family of Joseph, he has that family line. And so he goes to Bethlehem to be registered along with Mary, who was engaged to him and who was pregnant. And so this here also fulfills this prophecy. So in Micah 5:2, it says, Bethlehem Ephrathah, you are small among the clans of Judah, but one will come from you to be ruler over Israel for me. His origin is from antiquity and from ancient times. And so the reason that he goes all the way back here to Bethlehem is not just so that it'll be the lineage of David, but this was actually prophesied, hundreds of years before, that out of Bethlehem one would come who was going to be the Messiah, who was going to be the one to lead Israel back out of bondage, to lead them into their preferred future. And so Micah says it there in 5:2, and then Matthew quotes it in Matthew 2:6. It says, "And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah, because out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." And so, all these things happen in a way that if you look at it from the outside and you don't take into account the supernatural dynamic of it, you think, well, man, isn't that coincidental that Joseph and Mary wind up having to go back to Bethlehem? They just happen to have to go back to Bethlehem because of this crazy census, and that's where Jesus is born. But no, you see what's actually happening is God is sovereign over all these events. Nothing catches God off guard, and that's one thing that we need to realize. We were joking around beforehand that you just let God know what your plans are, and I'm sure He'll make sure that He works according to your timeline. How many of y'all have ever experienced the opposite of that, right? You let God know what your plans are, and He goes, watch this. You kind of throw something out in the middle of it, but it's one of those. It's like a confetti grenade. It's more blessed than even your plans would have been. But God has a way of mixing up our plans, what we might think is correct. You just think back to what we talked about last week. The angel came to Mary. He said, "Hey, Mary, even though you have lived your life well, you've been faithful, you are a great young Jewish girl. Your whole life, your life before you looks great. It's cupcakes and roses. You and Joseph are going to get married. Everything's going to be good. But oh wait, God is going to let you carry the new Messiah. Even though you've never had sex with a man, even though you're not even married yet, you're about to get pregnant. You're got to go through all of the negative views, all the criticisms, all the ostracization. You're going to go through all that for the sake of the Messiah." Mary had it all figured out, all planned out, and God threw that grenade out there in the middle of it, kind of blew up her plans, but it was for the better, right? There was a purpose in that. There was something glorious in the middle of that. Well, He's doing the same thing here. Because of that, this whole process is leading to Bethlehem, to where Jesus can be born and fulfill this prophecy. And so in Luke 2, verses 6 and 7, it says, "While they were there, the time came for her to give birth, and she gave birth to her firstborn son. And she wrapped him tightly in cloth and laid him in a manger, because there was no guest room available for them." And so while they were there in Bethlehem, we don't know how long it was. In any kind of show or depiction of it, it's usually like as they're riding into town, she's going into labor pains. That's usually how it works out. We don't know that. That's just sort of speculation or drama that's added to the story. We just know that while she was there, the time came for her to be delivered. And most likely, it wasn't like here in our town where we hop in the car, we drive 2 hours to a family gathering, and we drive 2 hours back all in the same day. This was a journey. It wasn't a super long journey going from Nazareth to Bethlehem, but it was a few days to get there. And so this was not something where they just ran over to Bethlehem real quick and then ran back. And so they would have gone, and because they were seeing family, they probably would have stuck around for a while. Now you notice that it says right here, there was no guest room available. How is that different than how we traditionally have heard the story? How is the story usually told? When Linus tells it, or whenever somebody else reads it?
Hotel, almost no room.
There's no room in the inn, right? That's how we've heard it for so long. And that goes back to the King James Version and even the New King James Version, those translations. It says because there was no room for them in the inn. Well, so we've romanticized that thought to where Joseph is going around town knocking on all the Holiday Inns and the comfort suites, and he's trying to find a place for them to stay, and all the managers are saying, no vacancy, leave me alone. And so, that's kind of the picture that we've seen. But that actually is very, 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 very unlikely for numerous reasons. One of which is Jewish culture is a hospitality culture. And if you refuse hospitality to somebody, especially a pregnant woman, man, that is just, you are really, really, really looked down upon. Go all the way back to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, whenever the angels went into Sodom and Gomorrah to check it out and see if all the negative, all the evil things they had heard were true. And Abraham had said, "Look, will you please spare the city? Will you please spare the city?" And they said, "If we find 5 righteous people, 10 righteous people, whatever, I can't remember what it was. If we find that many righteous people, then we'll spare the city." And they go in, and they're sitting out in the square, and Lot comes by, and he's like, "Guys, what are you doing out here?" And I'm like, oh, we're just going to sleep out here in the square. He's like, no, you're not sleeping out in the square. Come into my house. Let me host you. Please. He begs him, please don't stay out here, because he knows what's going to happen. And then later on that night, people come knocking on the door, saying, hey, send them out, and all this kind of stuff. And Lot says, no, please, guys, don't do this. They're under my house. They're under my protection. And he goes through some pretty extreme measures to try to protect them. Well, that's Jewish culture. You had obligations and expectations of hospitality. So most likely nobody would have refused a room to this family, or refused this room to especially a pregnant lady. And even more so, they were going to Bethlehem because why? Family. That's where family was. And so even more so, family would not have left them out in the cold. And so most likely what's really going on here is that it just means that because so many family had come in, that this family's house was kind of getting overloaded. And they didn't have just an extra room where they could put them by themselves. But what they would usually have is not necessarily a separate barn, but they would have a place where they would keep the animals in the house in the evenings. They would even have like a feeding trough and stuff like that. So probably they had to put them out in that room. And so even though we kind of romanticize the idea of it being a cave off somewhere or something like that, most likely it was a place where there was a house there, and it was something that they were a part of, and not necessarily the old rickety barn surrounded by animals and hay and stuff like that. All right, so anyway, they were there though, and what I really want to kind of highlight is that it says that the time came for her to give birth. And I think this is important for us to remember, that all of this is happening, and all these events are occurring according to God's plan, according to God's timeline. Galatians chapter 4 says this, says, when the time came to completion, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And so there is a timing element to all this. People have asked before, and I've heard this question, why didn't Jesus come during today's time, when people can communicate to everybody in the world in a moment's notice? He could FaceTime or Facebook Live the entire world, and everybody could hear his messages. He could get the message to more people. We've got email, we've got satellite TV. You go off into the bush out in Africa or something like that, and they may not have running water, but they might have a satellite dish on their house, something like that. And so, Jesus, man, he could have gotten the message around so much easier if he had come during this day and time. Well, God has his purposes for when he sent him. And there was some benefit to the time period that he came. Have you ever heard of the Pax Romana? Some of y'all maybe remember that from your history classes way back when. It means the Roman peace. And so because of how Rome had conquered so many areas and had put them underneath their different rule, that was basically a time period where that whole territory, or most of that territory, was for the most part a peaceful region, a peaceful area. And so Jesus was able to be born into a time when there was relatively, we won't say world peace, but there was very peaceful relationships in a massive area of the known world at that time. And so there was a time where Jesus could come in, where he could begin that ministry, and where that ministry could then expand out to a wide range of areas. Because you think about Jesus left the earth, and by the time all the disciples had moved on, John the Baptist was the last one. I'm sorry, not John the Baptist. John, the disciple, was the last of the disciples to die. By the time they moved on and were out of the picture, and Paul was out of the picture, that whole Mediterranean, all the Roman Empire, had heard the message of the gospel. And so because of Rome's occupation of so many areas and the ease of travel in the Roman Empire, the gospel was able to spread. And so God had a purpose in his time. This wasn't an accident. Everything that he wanted to happen happened when he wanted it to happen in the right way. And so when the time came to completion, Jesus came. And so he was born. He was laid there in a manger because there was no guest room, and that was her firstborn son. So then, that same night, in the same region, there were shepherds, and they were standing out in the fields, keeping watch at night over their flock. And then an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, Don't be afraid, for look, I proclaim to you good news of great joy that will be for all people. Today, in the city of David, a Savior was born for you, who is Messiah, the Lord. And this will be a sign for you. You will find a baby wrapped tightly in cloth and lying in a manger. And then suddenly there was a multitude of the heavenly hosts with the angel praising God, saying, Glory to God in the highest heaven, and peace on earth to people he favors. And so, you think about this message. First of all, who did the angels appear to? Shepherds. Now, you probably talked about this before, thought about this before. Like, usually whenever a king is born, who would you announce that to first?
The hierarchy.
Yeah, the hierarchy. You would tell all the government officials, you would tell the important people in the kingdom. You would let people who have clouts and have position, have authority, have power, have prestige, you would let them know about this Messiah being born. So, if I were putting all this together, if I was God, but with my still fallible mentality, if I was God, I'd be like telling all the different kings. I'd be I'd send an angel to Caesar, let him know that a new king was born. I'd be sending one, the kings, out in the eastern countries, not in whatever China was at that time, things like that. I'd be telling all the different kings all over the world, hey, look, a new ruler has come. This isn't just any ruler. This is the ultimate ruler. This is the ultimate king, and all this kind of stuff. So my mentality would be, hey, let's come in. Let's set the stage for Jesus to have power, to have authority, to have prestige, have people recognize who he is. But that wasn't God's process. He went out and he told the shepherds. And so it was nighttime, and these guys were out there watching their sheep at night. So they were probably like the head shepherds, right? The shepherds who were like the overall, the other shepherds, probably the lead shepherds.
Night shift.
It's the night shift, right? It's the ones like James knows. Whenever you're a rookie police officer, you get the last pick. So you wind up getting a shift that maybe nobody else wants, right? And so, we all know what that's like. Whenever you're the kind of low on the totem pole, you might get a shift at your job that nobody else wants because you're kind of the last to pick. That's what these guys were doing. It was Christmas Eve, and they were out watching the shepherds.
Well, it wasn't Christmas.
They didn't know it was
Christmas.
Christmas.
They didn't know it was Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
But it was nighttime, and they were out there. I mean, it was cold. It was probably snowy. Just kidding. It wasn't cold and snowy. But they were out there having to watch the sheep at night. And so this is not like God is announcing it even to the leaders of the Jewish community. He's announcing it to the nobodies, to the absolute zeros in the society. Probably a bunch of young kids. I mean, honestly, probably a bunch of young kids, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, something like that, who are out there watching the sheep, chucking rocks at each other, messing with each other, and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, these angels announce to them. So just imagine, the Messiah, the Savior of the world, is born. And the people that it gets announced to is a group of middle school Boy Scouts who are out camping, out in the woods. I mean, that's basically who God announced the birth of Jesus to. A bunch of middle school Boy Scouts hanging out in the woods. And so Jesus is announced, but he's announced to the common people, to probably the most common that you can get. And that's because Jesus didn't come just to save the elite. He didn't just come to save the privileged or these super religious. He came to save everybody, to seek and to save the lost. And throughout his ministry, we see him have a special concern for those people who are ostracized by society. To the woman who's caught in adultery, who he shows mercy to the woman at the well, who he shows mercy to the blind man, to the man with leprosy, to those types of people. Those are the ones who his heart really goes out to. And so they are, the angels come, says the angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. Now, tell me another point in the Bible, think back to Bible history, where we see the glory of the Lord in a visible display. You may think of something?
The fire.
Okay.
Well, actually, 2 points. So there's the burning bush, and then the pillar of fire.
Okay. Yeah, those are two really good examples. A burning bush, where Moses sees the bush that's on fire but not consumed. Okay, then you got the pillar of fire that would guide them at night. Okay. What else? What's another point?
Didn't the light shine down on Jesus as he was brought back up to heaven? Is that?
Yeah, that's one that hasn't happened yet at this point.
Right.
But yeah, that is one.
Time.
Okay.
Oh, prior to this, you mean?
Mhm.
Oh.
So I've got in mind, whenever God appeared to Moses on the mountain, on Mount Sinai, whenever he was giving him the law, and God says to Moses, tell all the people, set up a boundary around the mountain so the people don't come up and touch the mountain, because if they touch the mountain, they're going to die. And it says that lightning and thunder and smoke fell on the mountain. And it's basically like, it's like an earthquake of fire and all this kind of stuff. Think about the most messed up looking sci-fi movie you can imagine, where everything is, apocalyptic or something. That's probably what was going on. Well, that's the same kind of glory that is probably being described here. Like, this was a terrifying kind of glory. It may not have been lightning and thunder and smoke, but it was something that would blow your mind. It would make you just in awe. It would make you, want to cry, run home to mommy, and leave the sheep behind. This was a terrifying kind of situation. And we've seen before how most of the time whenever an angel appears to somebody, one of the first things they say is what?
Don't be afraid.
Don't be afraid. Fear not. Something like that. And so, these guys, these young boys who are out there watching the sheep are terrified. And I would say, rightly so. They probably thought, we're dead. It's like, I don't know what you did, Eli, but you got us in big trouble now. God hadn't sent his angels to get onto us, But they began telling them good news. The angel said to them, what? Don't be afraid, for I proclaim to you good news of great joy. You know what that word good news is? Gospel, right? Evangelion, the good news, the gospel. I proclaim to you the gospel of great joy that will be for all people. Think about it when you think about it that way. Isn't that a cool way to think about that? The angel is basically the first proclamation of the gospel following Jesus' birth was to these shepherds. I proclaim to you the gospel of great joy that will be for all people. Not just for the Jews, not just for the Gentiles, not for the rich, not just for the poor, but will be for all people. That today, in the city of David, a Savior was born for you, who is the Messiah, the Lord. And if you think back to the way that most of us grew up on it, we've heard it, who is Christ the Lord. And so Christ is just the Greek version of the word Messiah. The angels would have actually said Messiah to these young boys. And so they were announcing the coming of that expected Messiah the Jewish people had been looking for centuries. This little group of middle schoolers got the news first. And so they probably, at this point, one of the things that we learn about boys especially is that they are trained from an early age. They're trained to know the Torah. So every Jewish boy memorizes the Torah. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they memorize that. You think about that. That's pretty tough. And they memorize it in Hebrew. So it's even harder, right? And so they had to memorize the Torah. And then if there were some exceptional boys, then they would go on to more school, and they would have to memorize and learn the rest of what we call the Old Testament. And then if they were really exceptional, then they would keep going to rabbinical school, and they would learn all of the commentaries, all the extra stuff that was written about the Old Testament, and they would eventually, hopefully, become a rabbi. Well, if you didn't really excel at a young age, then you were given, a nice pat on the back, an attaboy, and then sent home to dad to learn the trade. And so, were these some of the exceptional students? No. So they may not have even fully understood all the messianic hope, the messianic expectation, even though they probably had a general understanding about it. But it's interesting how once again we see that Jesus comes to the common people. Not just the religious know-it-alls, not just the religious elite or the exceptional. He comes to the common people, just like his disciples. How many of his disciples were trained rabbis? 0, right? They were fishermen. And the fact that they were fishermen means that they were rabbi school dropouts. They had never been chosen to continue to go the way. And so the Messiah is announced to these young boys, and they give them a sign. We've had this pattern of signs, right? Zechariah had a son. Mary had a son. This will be a sign for you. You will find a baby wrapped tightly in cloth and lying in a manger. And so that probably wasn't, too hard to find. I mean, I'm sure there probably weren't a whole lot of babies that were laying in mangers around the city. We don't know that for sure. It's a possibility. But did they give him any other directions that we know of? No. I mean, Bethlehem's not a giant city. It's a small town, but it had swelled. The population had swelled because of the census and stuff like that. It's not a large city. But how did these shepherds go find Jesus? You ever thought about that? Because most of our major scenes are already happening there, right? I mean, they're already there, bowing down. There's always that one shepherd that brought sheep with him. I don't know why, but he's always got him over his shoulder. I never quite understood why he brought the sheep. Maybe that's his pet sheep or something like that. But they, I don't know. Most likely these boys wanted to go see the Messiah, but they also knew they had responsibilities. Really, what were their responsibilities?
Their sheep.
The sheep. So there's a good chance they brought the sheep with them. And so in the middle of the night, a big group of middle school boys starts driving sheep through the village of Bethlehem, knocking on doors. Do you have a baby? Is there a baby in here? I mean, do you think, their dad was probably, everybody's coming in and saying, Josiah, your son is out here, and he's waking up the whole town. And so they finally find Jesus, and they begin to worship him. And so they say, this is the sign that you're going to find. The angels begin praising God and singing. And I've always wondered if anybody else saw this, or if it was one of those miraculous things where only those shepherds saw it, or people in the village were like, looks like angels, up in the sky. I think I can hear them. I think I can hear them singing. And then when the angels had left, it says, let's go straight to Bethlehem and see what has happened, which the Lord has made known to us. They hurried off and found both Mary and Joseph and the baby who was lying in a manger. And so obviously Luke skips a bunch of information that we would love to know about. One day we can ask, what really happened. But they go riding into town, making a big stir. And they somehow, after a period of time, whether God, divinely directed them straight to, Jesus' manger, or where they went knocking on doors or trying to find, or where they were just looking for a crying baby, listening or whatever. Well, that wouldn't work because no crying he made. Wait, that's not in the scripture.
No, you're right.
It's not actually in the Bible. Just in case you wanted to know, Jesus was a real baby. So, ladies and dads, did he cry?
Yes.
He cried. Trust me, he cried. Especially if he was laying in a manger.
No, he was a perfect baby.
Huh?
He was
Well,
a
crying's
perfect
not-
baby.
Crying's
He
not
wasn't
that
a perfect baby, but he was still a
baby.
baby. So.
He also pooped
He
it.
communicated perfectly as a baby. So, anyway, they find Mary and Joseph and the baby lying in a manger. And then after seeing him, they reported the message they were told about this child, and all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said to them. And so after seeing Jesus, they reported the message they were told, and people were amazed. They were probably also annoyed, but that didn't make it into the scripture. And so these young shepherd boys, they understood what needed to happen as a result of what they had just discovered. This wasn't something that they needed to just keep to themselves. This was something that was worth talking about. And obviously, this story must have gotten around because remember we talked about this a couple weeks ago. What was Luke's interaction with Jesus? He didn't have an interaction with Jesus, right? Luke was not a disciple of Jesus, as in one of the 12 disciples. Luke joined the party. He linked up with Paul on Paul's second missionary journey about halfway through. And so Luke is going off of stories. He is writing down the oral history of this whole story about Jesus. And so that's one thing that we have to realize is that Luke is telling this because this is a story that he had heard. And so these shepherds, he may have even meet some of these shepherds or something like that along the way. These shepherds went out and they started telling the story. And then other people, can you believe what those shepherd boys said the other night? They said this about Jesus. And who knows if even down the road that story was linked up, or something like that. But I'm sure Mary continued to tell these stories because it says here at the end of this story, but Mary was treasuring up all these things in her heart and meditating on them. And so she was probably, thinking about this, trying to wrap her mind around all that was going on. Because, it's one thing for an angel to appear to you. well, I guess I'm trying to say this. I think that we look back on the story and we have the full picture. And so for us, we kind of know the steps. And even for those of us who have been in church a long time, it's almost become routine. Like you think about your favorite movie. You ever watch your favorite movie and you start laughing before the funny thing actually happens? Y'all know what I'm talking about? I do that. You know, when we would go back and watch some of our old favorite movies, you know, like we watched Home Alone 2 the other night, and I was saying what I was about to say, you know, before I actually said it. And so, you know, we kind of read the Christmas story like that, where we already know what's coming, so it's not as surprise, you know, or unexpected. But you just think Mary is learning all of this as it happens. And so an angel comes and says, hey, even though you're a virgin, you're about to get pregnant. And she's like, God said so, you know, I'll do whatever God says. But then, you know, for her, 3-4 months later, she finally figures out, okay, what that angel said, you know, is actually starting to take place. I'm starting to see some growth, starting to feel something in there. You know, she begins to say, oh, wow, this really is happening. And then she has to tell Joseph about it. And then Joseph's like, you know, he is going to divorce her, but then he comes back and he says, hey, I had an angel tell me that what you said is true. So, you know, I'm going to go ahead and marry you and be your husband. She's saying, oh, well, God is working all these details out. And then, you know, they go to Bethlehem, and whether she understood about the prophecies and all that kind of stuff with Bethlehem and being born in Bethlehem, we don't know. You know, the song doesn't answer that part of the question for us. But we don't know what she knew. But then she has this baby, and she's probably holding it in his hands, and she's probably thinking, one day you'll walk on water. No, she didn't. She didn't think that. She probably didn't think that. But she's looking. She's like, okay, so this is that baby that the angel told me about. This is that baby that's supposed to be the Messiah. You know, how am I going to know that this is really the Messiah? And then all of a sudden, bam, 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 bam. These little middle school boys are outside saying, hey, is there a baby in a manger in here? Can we wake him up?
I just got
I just got to sleep.
Get out!
Lily saw some yesterday, and she said, imagine Mary, young mother, just finally gets the baby to sleep. And somebody knocks on the door and says, hey, can I play your baby a drum solo?
Yeah.
Probably not, kid. But all of a sudden, these little boys say, hey, some angels just told us that the Messiah was born. We find him wrapped in cloths and laying in a manger. Is your baby wrapped in cloths, laying in a manger? She's like, yeah, he was just born tonight. You know, so all these things are happening to confirm in Mary's heart what God, through the angel Gabriel, had told her 9 months earlier. And so all this is taking place to show her that these things are coming about just as God had planned. And so, you know, we need to remember that whenever God guides us into a new stage of life, or you know, whether it's a change in a big change in our life or a small change in our life, that we're kind of in the middle of that journey, like Mary was at this point. That we're having to learn and discern what God is doing in our life as we go through the process. If you're like we have, there's probably been many times in your life where you think God's leading you on a certain direction, and also you get halfway through this process and there's a turn in the road that you weren't aware of. You know, something, I thought we were going this direction, and God's got a little dog leg over here to the left that we're going to go down. You know, we're going to go this direction. And that's just kind of the nature of walking by faith. Walking by faith means you don't always know for sure the next step. And so we need to just learn to trust in that. But then whenever we do see God at work, we need to be like those shepherds and just proclaim it. And we just talk about it, share it. Let people see the goodness that is our God, and talk about that. And I think whenever we do that, whenever we share the goodness of God in our life and the way that He's working in our life, then we'll have people that are like this, that are amazed at what the shepherds said to them. And so let's not be hesitant to proclaim that amazing thing that God is doing in your life. One of the strongest witnessing tools that you have is your story. It's your testimony of how God has been faithful to you, how He, you know, whatever your story is. And sometimes, you know, sometimes we think, you know, like for me, my testimony is that I was raised in a Christian home. I always tell people I was born on Wednesday and in church on Sunday, which isn't technically true, but it's pretty close. But you know, I've been in church my whole life. I'm a church kid. I'm a deacon's kid. You know, that's my story. I didn't, you know, have a drug problem or spend 30 years running from God or something like that. You know, for the most part, my life has been pretty much following the Lord, or at least in that church sphere. And so sometimes we have that story and we think, well, I don't have that great testimony of God saving me out of the depths, you know, or something like that, and restoring me and turning my life around. Well, that's fine. That's one kind of testimony, but then there's also the testimony of God's faithfulness. You know, God's faithfulness with godly parents and you know, a godly, faithful church to be a part of, and saving you, you know, without making you go through some of those struggles, and God's faithfulness over a lifetime. That's a powerful testimony, just like being saved out of the depths of darkness is a powerful testimony. And so we should boldly proclaim and share and be excited about how God has worked in our life and how He continues to work in our lives. So I would encourage you to even this week, you know, you may have opportunities to share your story or talk about your faith or talk about what God's doing in your life over this Christmas break with some family members. I would love to hear you know, share those stories and even share how maybe God used some of your stories this week to touch somebody's life. All right? Well, let me pray for us. Lord, thank you so much for this day, and thank you so much that you do have a plan and a purpose, and we're thankful so much for the birth of Jesus and how it shows that your timing is always perfect, your positioning is always perfect, and the way you choose to do things is always perfect. There's always a greater purpose, even when we can't completely understand it. Lord, I pray that you would help us to be bold this week in sharing the love of Christ with our family members and other friends that we come into contact with, and just to be proud to talk about how great our God is. Thank you for your faithfulness to us. We pray in Jesus' name.